Ahoy and welcome to this Narrowboat adventure. Today I'm here with a very interesting woman, Kate Saffin. We're going to be talking a little bit about the women of the wartime waterways, which Kate knows a lot more about than I do. And so let's go on and do that.
So make the tea first, remember. Tea was a very important part of working on the boats during the war, so I think it's important to join in and have a cup of tea.
So go and make your cup of tea and join us when you have it ready. How did you get interested in the women of the wartime waterways and sort of the role that they played?
I moved onto a boat in 1999, same boat I live on now. Never have quite got round to changing it because I'm very fond of her. Beautiful boat. And I can't remember when I first encountered the stories of, they were known, they had a nickname, the Idle Women. We have a book here, Idle Women, by Susan Wolfe. And I read that first, then I encountered several others which we can talk about later. And I was already doing some plays and drama based on the waterways. The first thing I did was an adaptation of Ramlin Rose, the boatwoman story, which is the only real account we've got of the social history of boating. We've got lots on bridges and locks and all the engineering. But Sheila Stewart did this extraordinary thing where she interviewed the last generation of women, including the mother of a boatwoman I knew, the last generation to be born on boats, grow up, bring their families up. So I was already doing that. So I was interested in other stories, and I came across, I think, Susan Wolfe's book and read it. So that's how I got interested in them. So our show is, well, Isabel's War is about a young woman becoming a wartime trainee, which is what they were known as. It was called the Women's Training Scheme. Heather's piece, Idle Women and Judy's, is interesting. That draws on archive material and oral histories, which are available through the Waterways archive. But hers includes the story of a woman called Nancy Ridgway, who worked on the Leeds and Liverpool. So the women that I knew about, the ones that got their name the Idle Women, mostly worked on the Grand Union. But there were women working in other places, and Nancy was thoroughly intrepid. There was only a very small group of them, but they worked on real big barges, not narrowboats. They turned in big boats. And of course the other thing is that although we think of these women who worked on the boats during the war as doing something very special, which it was, and it was certainly very different for them, there were women on the boats before. You know, women had been working on the boats since the mid-19th century when, hop back a bit, you know, the big development of Canal time and very, very prosperous, and everybody did wonderfully well, and then the railway came along. And then it started to get harder, and that's when the boatmen, who had formerly lived on land and run boats and were quite prosperous, started to bring their families onto the boats in order to survive. It became a family undertaking. So there were women working on the boats during the war who came from boating families. And particularly during the First World War, some of those women were coping on their own. There's a lovely bit in Ramlin Rose where she says that, you know, if the men had gone off to war, that the women, some of them struggled on, trying to be captain and best mate. And it was probably hard work. So women have played an important part in working on the boats for a long time.
So why don't you tell us a little bit briefly about what women's role was on the boats during the war?
Well, for the Women's Training Scheme, there was an advert. It probably began the very early part of the war. There was somebody called Daphne March, and the family owned a working boat. She was an Oxford graduate. She decided she was going to work the boat, I think as part of her war effort. And it was over in the Gloucester area on the Sharpness. And she put an advert in the Times, and I think it was January 1941, which said, woman boat owner seeks crew. No, woman boat owner, Oxford graduate, seeks crew. Clearly being an Oxford graduate was very useful. And so she started working that, and then she was joined at one point by Eiley Gayford, who became a trainer later on the Grand Union, and Molly Trail. So they learnt a lot of their boating with her. And I think it was out of that grew this idea. I'm not quite sure who took it to the Ministry of Transport, but they created the Women's Training Scheme. And actually, there's a lovely letter here we are. Thank you for your letter. The training scheme for women is briefly as follows. Training takes from 2 to 3 months according to individual ability, and during that period you will learn the entire management of a pair of boats. The motorboat and the butty being the one that is towed by the motor. It was pretty explicit. It told them what they were going to do, that they would be living entirely and working on the boats, that it was working 7 days a week, but although the work is not particularly arduous, long hours are worked over the 7-day week. I think whoever wrote this boat didn't realise how often the trainees were going to get into trouble and need to push it off the bank with a long shaft. I think they found it fairly arduous quite a lot of the time, actually. They were paid £2 a week during their training, and then once trained, £3 a week was the minimum. But it was very much up to them to find loads and to work, because they were paid on tonnage.
So what actually were the boats like back then? Because obviously they weren't what we have today.
Well, interestingly, we have here one of them, right next to us here. It's Cleopatra, who was a GUCC, Grand Union Canal Carrying Company, butty. Margaret Cornish was one of the trainees. She started her training with Daphne French. A lot of Daphnes in this story. And ended up carrying on working with Daphne as a trainer's mate. So she was helping with training. And Daphne, there in that picture, is sitting on the stern of that boat there. So that's lovely that we've got this boat here in the basin. So that's what it looked like. They were 70 feet long. They had the back 10 foot was a cabin. The butty cabin, the towed boat, the one without an engine, was a little bit bigger. It was just a little bit bigger because when they put motors into the horse boats, they chopped a bit of the cabin off. And also the motor had gunnels, so the cabin had a little side deck that you could walk down. The butty was always just...
And so they were living in a 10-foot cabin?
Yep. So it was a case of one had the cross bed. That's the bed that folds out of the cupboard, and the other would have the side bed, and they would tend to arrange it so their feet met. And it was quite a challenge because, of course, for a lot of the boating families tended to be quite small. I think if you grew very tall, you probably left and went and worked somewhere else. I think it did tend to be quite small, and they were used to being in a tiny cabin and working around each other. Whereas most of the girls were coming from quite middle-class families, probably quite spacious houses. So to suddenly find that they were having to share this minute space. And there are some lovely stories. There's mention of one who stood patiently in the cabin waiting to be shown the accommodation. We think she probably didn't last very long. A lot of them didn't last very long. A lot of them were defeated very quickly by the sheer hard work, and it was primitive. There was no plumbing. There was a bucket in the engine room and a water can, and that was it. But a number of them, I think it was about a dozen pairs, crewed by 3 women. So the steerer would usually have the butty to herself. That was kind of her privilege. And then the other 2 would share the motor. And there was about a dozen pairs that worked on until the end of the war.
Wow, that's amazing.
I often wonder whether, if I'd signed up for it in 1943, would I have lasted? I like to think I would. I'm a boater, but do you know, I wonder whether I would. The journey was to go down the Paddington Arm, down the Regent's Canal to Limehouse. So come down past where we are now. Yeah. And in Limehouse they would load with, most commonly I think, steel or timber. It was mostly war materials going out to Birmingham. And then loaded, sheeted up so the cover's over, because once you've got a loaded boat, it's very low in the water. You don't want it to fill up with rain, because if it does, you'll sink. The boaters had this expression about that a well-loaded boat, the sparrows could drink from the gunnels because there'd be that much. They were really low in the water. So off they would set for Birmingham, which is something like 190 locks. You might need to check that one, but there's a lot of them. So it's back up the Regents, up through Camden, turn right at Bulls Bridge, so back we started, and then up to the outskirts of Birmingham, to Tylesley Wharf, where they offloaded to day boats. And there were trains of day boats that went through Birmingham and delivered things to the various factories. Pretty much everywhere they delivered to has now disappeared. There are pictures and records of it. They then went to Coventry to pick up coal. Now in the early days, they took what was the much hated route, which was known as the Bottom Road.
But they hated it. Absolutely hated it. Everybody hated the Bottom Road. It was filthy, it was dirty, it was single locks. Although at Grand Union you had nice big ones. So if you had a pair of boats, you tied them together and you took them up the flights, because there's a lot of locks between here and Birmingham, believe me. But this going across the Bottom Road was hideous to go round to the coalfields. So by 1943, it was a year into the scheme, that had changed. However, this is the route for our tour this summer, and we decided we would do the Bottom Road, just because we thought we'd like to make life difficult, but also because it makes a bit more of a circuit, rather than coming straight back down through Warwick and Leamington. So that was the route they worked. It took 3 weeks to do a full load. They would take steel or timber up to Birmingham, and then they brought back coal from Coventry. On the way back, they delivered to the commonest places were the paper mill at Apsley.
And a bakery, was it an ABC bakery in Camden, They liked Apsley best, because once you'd unloaded at Apsley, you didn't have to turn into London, you could simply go straight to the depot. So they had a proper country. And you could go to the public baths.
Oh, yes, I can understand why you've got to do it. The other day when I saw your talk, I thought it was really interesting that you mentioned about where the IW nickname came from.
Susan Wolfett, whose husband was Donald Wolfett, West End producer, was a bit older than some of the other women, she was in her late 30s, and she had children at school. And it was her daughter Harriet who, after the war, joked that the IW on the badge stood for idle women. And her mother thought, oh, that's a bit of a laugh, I'll put that in the book. You will now hear, and often see it written, that this was a nickname given to them by the boatmen. That this very kind of closed community of boaters, these women had come into it, they nicknamed them the idle women. And I've never found that a convincing argument for several reasons. One is that very few of the boaters learned to read or write. Now, I knew Jack and Rose Skinner in later years, remarkable couple. Jack had a wonderful ear for words, and he would do plays on words, but neither of them had been to school. And so firstly, the boatmen would not have created a nickname based on letters, because they didn't use them. The other thing is that I think there were, I'm sure there's a whole spread, but they were broadly, the boatmen like Jack, who I knew, incredibly respectful of women. Absolutely no way would he might shout at the trainees, he might get cross with them, but there was no way he'd give them a very kind of insulting nickname.
I'm going to come back to you very soon with Kate again to speak about the play that she has written based on most of this history, and well, we'll talk more about what it's about in that video. Thank you, Kate, for talking to us about the women of the wartime waterways. If you would like to find out, why don't you recommend some books if they want to find out more about the history of the women in the waterways?
I have weighed the women I've mentioned with Susan Wolfett wrote. Eileen Gayford, the amateur boat women, a nickname that I think came from originally being called Kid, which she didn't like, which talks about her experiences. And Troubled Waters by Margaret Cornish, who was a trainer's mate with Daphne French. It's interesting because actually from her we hear a lot more about the ones who didn't make it.
Yeah, so many
Peggy, the editor of the Passion, and others who just found it too hard. which I think is interesting, because on the whole it's very easy when you read these accounts to think, oh well, it was all jolly gung-ho and everybody got stuck in and did their bit for the war and wasn't it splendid? It wasn't that easy. It was tough, and we tend to hear from those who survived it. So it's very interesting to hear Margaret. And the other thing, it's a good moment to plug my website.
Yes.
If you find Alarum Theatre, www.alaruntheatre.co.uk, there's lots about the show. But there's also a page of resources that has some links to some rather splendid bits of wartime Pathé Movietone news,
Ah, lovely.
which are rather wonderful.
Is that some of the videos you showed in your talk?
Yes.
They were great, so do go and check that out. I'll put a link in the description of the video.
And there's also a number of, there's some articles, there's some obituaries. Oh, another book actually, which I haven't brought out with me, is another famous one. It was written by Emma Smith called Maiden's Trip, which is sort of, I mean, it is autobiographical, but it's an odd sort of mix of fiction and autobiography. I think it's got a lovely freshness about it because she wrote it immediately after the war. I don't think anybody ever did any editing. So you sort of, but it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun to read.
Great.
So that's all the books.
Lovely. Well, do check out Kate's website, and as I say, I'll put a link in the description down below. If you'd like to see the next video with Kate in, which is going to be about the play she's written on this subject, then do click subscribe in the button just down below, and join us again on this Narrowboat adventure. Thank you so much for watching, and have a nice day. Bye!
Thank you.